This morning on BRN, calls to the North Carolina gambling helpline have increased 79%. And joining me now to discuss this and a lot more, Dr. Michelle Malkin is with East Carolina University, where she is the director of the university's Gambling Research and Policy Initiative. Dr. Malkin, so great to see you. Thanks for joining us this morning.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and look, we have covered sports gambling as it's begun to spread around the United States. And full disclosure, I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. So this in particular piqued my interest. Let's talk about some of your research, and in particular, the gambling helpline that exists in North Carolina. Calls went up 79% since sports betting was enacted in March. I want to get your thoughts about that.
Well, I think it's twofold. One is more people are engaging with gambling because it's A, socially acceptable, and B, legal. And so they're curious. There's a massive amount of kind of advertising and bonuses, which encourage people to at least try it out. So you have kind of this new idea, socially acceptable, let's try this out. And some people will inevitably end up falling down the line of gambling disorder. And so that whole thing is one piece of it. The second thing that is really impacting the helpline and increasing calls is obviously awareness of that it even exists because of all the ads, because of people accessing gambling, that the helpline information is out there. So you have two things. You have an increase in gambling and an increase of concern around gambling at the same time as you have an increase of awareness about the help available. So both of those probably play into why there was an increase. And we see this happen in every single state where gambling goes legal. We see a massive increase among the first couple of months, but actually when we continue over the first couple of years of legality, and we don't know when and where that's going to kind of taper off and even either get even with kind of no more increase or actually decrease. And another thing to know about helpline calls is about 50% are individuals seeking assistance, and another 50% is individuals concerned about somebody else. There's also a small percentage, so more than there's the 50-50, but it's actually probably 45-45 because about 10% are people who use that helpline to understand how to gamble. And so they'll ask questions like, how do I do this? And they'll be like, that's not what this helpline's about. So you also have people just not knowing where to get good information about how to gamble on sports correctly. And so what they will do is call the helpline for that information. And so you have kind of that 45-45, and then 10% of people that aren't using it for the right reason.
And in terms of staffing, let's talk about that because I've worked in customer contact centers in other businesses. You mentioned that the demand so far hasn't tapered off, or at least doesn't look like it's tapering off in the next, pardon me, I have a little bit of a cold, but hasn't tapered off. What does that mean for staffing to take those calls? Because I would assume you need human beings, although I guess you could use some level of AI and chatbots initially, but you need a human being to answer that phone call. You got to train them. So what does it mean in terms of staffing?
So North Carolina, like most states in the US, actually contract that work out to a more national, international entity that does helplines only. And there's a couple of different organizations that focus within the kind of gambling disorder realm. And so when a state contracts with them, they have a massive amount of helpline individuals, but they're actually receiving helpline calls from all over the country. And then they will know which state those calls come from based on the individual's information.
So in terms of this volume, are there some lessons here? North Carolina, as we said, enacted or at least started gambling in March, but are there some lessons? I would imagine that the data that you're collecting and sifting through could inform policymakers and regulators about how do you manage this? Because the last thing I think anyone is intending for, including the gaming organizations, is they don't want addicts and they don't want to inflict any damage on people. So, are there some lessons here for our policymakers here in North Carolina?
Yeah, I think one of the first lessons is that the callers are not only increasing, but they're getting younger. We're seeing a larger percentage of people who are kind of emerging adults, 18 to 24-year-olds, having issues. And a lot of times they're not necessarily the one calling, but it's a family member, a parent, or a friend concerned about their behavior that is calling on their behalf to figure out what to do. So we are seeing a much larger increase in young people who are facing gambling related harms. And so the calls are going that way, which means we need a lot more research to understand behavior and risk among young gamblers, because most of the research we have is among kind of the traditional over 40, mostly male population that was experiencing most of these gambling related harms. So that's one of the big lessons that we're learning is the age is decreasing as gambling has become more like a video game and more like comfort for young people to engage in it. And so we see that. We also see a larger percentage of women engaging in gambling and potentially having um, suffered from gambling related harms. And so we definitely need more resources going to those kind of gender and young. But the other thing we know for sure is that people in more socioeconomic depressed areas are more likely to engage in gambling in risky ways in hopes to better their lives. And so there are different motivators for why people gamble, and also why people then inevitably, some people will suffer from gambling related harms. Something to know that is really important for legislators to know is that most people don't know how to gamble healthy. And so they don't necessarily know the games, and then they don't know how do I set proper, budgetary limits to my gambling, because nobody kind of gives that information to them. They also don't know how to recognize when they themselves or somebody they know is initially suffering from maybe one or two gambling related harms, which is a great time for that person to kind of get the interventions they need so they can stay gambling in a healthy way. Um, so because we don't kind of educate and do that outreach to people of all ages, it becomes a problem that we're only really helping the people who are already down the path and too far down to really be able to engage in gambling in a healthy way. I will do a little bit of pushback on one thing you said, though. You said, the industry doesn't want people with addiction. And I will say, the industry will say 100% we don't want people with addiction. But when we look at recent work done by prevalence scholars in other states, we are seeing that the vast majority of tax dollars are coming from people who have the most risk for gambling. And so in one state, we saw that 7% of those people who are gambling were making up 95% of the revenue. And so we really, really need to appropriately be doing prevalence studies, understanding where risk is, and making sure we're doing the education and outreach early so that we can stop people from possibly going down that path of suffering from gambling related harms, developing gambling disorder, and then that leading them down to really bad areas. We know over 50% of people with gambling disorder will commit a gambling motivated crime, connected to the fact that they at some point run out of legal means to access money, and staying gambling and or paying off gambling debts, chasing losses in the hopes of a win becomes so much more important. But the other thing that happens is 1 in 5 individuals with gambling disorder will attempt suicide. And so I do this work every day, reminding myself I'm doing this work to save lives. And I know anybody in the legislature would care about that. We're trying to save lives. People aren't just degenerate gamblers. They don't start that way. They like to use those kind of words on people who go down that path. It's nobody knows when they place their first bet if they're the one who's most at risk. And one thing we do know is an early win, a large win, are the kinds of things that will keep people going down that path.
Yeah. Well, I will certainly accept your correction. I was not trying to, I don't know what anyone's thinking, honestly.
Most people and the industry will say that, but what we actually know is there's a lot of data that they're collecting. They know who is
Sure.
risky. They know how to identify those people. And as much as they will put out these, if you have a problem, call blah, 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 that's not enough to truly
Right.
get somebody who has gambling disorder to stop, because the person with gambling disorder can't stop. It's an addiction and it needs to be treated as such.
Yeah, and it's gamified, and I wish we had more time, but you know what, Doctor, we're going to bring you back. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you back again on the program very soon.
My pleasure.
And don't forget to subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Morning Pulse, for all the news in one place. Details, of course, are at our website. And we're back again tomorrow for another edition of BRN. Until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.